Okay, well, welcome everyone to another RIS interview where we bring you the story behind the cutting edge research that made it into our journal, the Review of International Studies, also known as RIS. Today, I'm thrilled to be talking to Rens van Munster, who is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, and Casper Sylvest, who is an associate professor at the Department of History at the University of Southern Denmark. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You have a new article in the Review of International Studies entitled Nuclear Weapons, Extinction and the Anthropocene, Reappraising Jonathan Schell. Let me start by asking you both about your academic journeys. What brought you together and how did you end up becoming interested in this area of research? Rens, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think when we first met, we were both still employed by the political science department at the University of Southern Denmark. I had just completed my PhD dissertation there, and Casper had just moved back to Denmark after completing his dissertation at the University of Cambridge. I think we started playing squash together, but quickly discovered that our interests overlapped beyond sports. So at the time I was working on catastrophic imaginaries in the wake of 9/11, very much inspired by the work of Günther Anders, a German Jewish philosopher of technology. And Casper had just started writing about the classical realist John Hertz, who is most famous in IR for his formulation of the security dilemma, but his work on atomic weapons, survival and technology shared many of the same features I found in Anders' work. So these overlaps, I think, made us increasingly curious about the history of nuclear weapons and how this technology forged new understandings of war, the environment, and the human condition during the early Cold War.
Yeah, and I think, if I remember correctly, we began these conversations really by thinking about sort of total or outsized security threats, and we conceptualized them initially as planetary threats, and it was really sort of radical thinking about unconventional thinking, if you will, about nuclear weapons that sort of inspired us on that journey. And I think one of the things that happened at that stage was we became convinced that something was missing in the sort of historical narratives about security that a lot of contemporary scholarship is relying on. So about, it must almost be 10 years ago now, we applied for and was awarded a grant by the Danish Research Council on globality and planetary security. And some of the things we did in that project was to look at sort of the historical production of images of the whole world in the post-war period, but in particular thinking about nuclear weapons and how that produced sort of new understandings of technology and the environment and so on. And this has been really rewarding. And then when we came towards the end of that project, we, I think, naturally began asking questions about, so what were sort of the afterlives of this kind of thinking? Where did it travel? Where was it picked up? And so on. And it was really there that we, I think, developed an interest in Jonathan Schell.
So thank you for that. So for those of us who don't know much about this area of research, could you, in regard to your article, could you give us a brief outline of where it takes us and what it's about? Rens, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, so our article, I think, is very much inspired by recent attempts in IR and elsewhere to confront the challenges associated with the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, for those who don't know, is a term that denotes a new geological age named after the traces left by human activity. And in everyday use, the Anthropocene has increasingly taken on a dystopian meaning and has come to signify how human disturbances now threaten the livability of the planet. And we seek to contribute to this literature on the Anthropocene by stressing the profound historical and intellectual links between our current predicament and that of the nuclear age. So basically we think it's important to trace the history of these security problems today, including climate change, species extinction, and biodiversity loss, to the Cold War nuclear arms race. So this is really our starting point. And we do so by reappraising the work of Jonathan Schell, who was the best-selling author of The Fate of the Earth, a book that came out in 1982. And Jonathan Schell came to regard extinction as a defining feature of the nuclear age. And in this article, we suggest that this insight remains deeply relevant for rethinking human-Earth relations in the Anthropocene. So we go about it is that we first provide a brief introduction to Jonathan Schell and locate his writings in a broader intellectual and historical context. Specifically, we suggest that core features of his work can be read against the backdrop of political realism, as well as anti-nuclear thought during the 1950s and 60s. We then go on how Schell's interest in the ecological effects of nuclear weapons use kind of propelled him towards a global ecological vision that foreshadowed the arrival of humankind as a geological agent. And finally, we discuss Schell's conceptualization of extinction and then address its strengths and weaknesses in thinking through the challenges of the Anthropocene.
Very interesting. So, Casper, why specifically did you want to revisit the work of Jonathan Schell and not others, for example?
Well, I think for some time now, also in relation to the previous project we did, Rens and I, we've discussed how IR and security studies function as disciplines. And I guess we've been especially perplexed by the way in which public intellectuals and figures working on the margins of these disciplines in think tanks or elsewhere are not always part of the conversation we're having in the discipline. And then when we couple that observation with another observation, which is that some contemporary thinking about the questions that Rens just mentioned, the Anthropocene, extinction, and so on, it sort of tend to install a historical rupture around the time of the end of the Cold War. And this sort of sharp break prevents us from looking at human-nature relations in that perspective, or think about extinction in a sort of longer, in terms of longer historical continuity. So as at that point, we thought, well, this is, probably an opportune moment to revisit Schell. And of course, this is, as we try to show in the article, Schell dealt with nuclear weapons from an existentialist perspective, and he was prompted by recent scientific work that sort of veered in a more sort of global ecological direction. And it certainly comes out in some of the last essays he wrote. So our hope is that sort of the article can contribute to breaking down some of the barriers that I just mentioned.
Okay. Rens, for your point of view, is Schell, he's obviously a fascinating figure, you've explained that, but perhaps you could tell us why that is, why he's so fascinating.
Yeah, sure. I think this is something both Casper and I could talk about at great length, but let me just give you a couple of things here. And I think one thing that makes Schell such an intriguing figure for us is that he's really difficult to pigeonhole. So he had a keen interest in political theory and academic international relations, but he himself overwhelmingly wrote for non-specialized audiences. And I spent some time in the archives, and it's very clear that from an early age on, Jonathan Schell saw himself first and foremost as a writer. He agonized about whether he would be a good writer or not. And he started his writing career as a journalist at the New Yorker, where he came of age under the editorial and personal guidance of William Shawn, who happened to be the father of his lifelong friend Wallace Shawn, the famous actor and playwright. And crucially, I think it's this kind of writer identity that Schell cultivated that allowed him to consider nuclear weapons from a broader and in some ways more interesting perspective than was common for much of IR scholarship at the time. So whereas IR scholars generally examined nuclear weapons in the narrow context of deterrence and national security, Schell instead stressed their existential implications, their ecological footprint, and called for a global or planetary perspective. And this clearly resonated with global audiences. So also in the archives, you see that Schell kept letters from readers who felt inspired by his work and adopted his book in teaching for theater plays and poems. And the book itself sold over 100,000 copies in the first 6 months. So it's quite remarkable that Schell succeeded in bringing specialized scientific knowledge about the ecological effects of nuclear war into the homes of ordinary people. And in doing so helped to re-energize the nuclear disarmament movement in the early 1980s. And Schell's book even prompted a coordinated response from the Reagan White House, which tells you something about its political standing at the time. And to me, this puts him on the same level as someone like Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring animated the environmental movement in the 1960s. And I think Schell did something similar in the 1980s.
Okay, so Casper, you argue in your article that there are tensions in Schell's work and that these tensions are both illuminating and productive. Could you elaborate a little bit on this or give us some examples?
Yeah, so in the article, we detailed, especially towards the end of the article, how Schell took inspiration, was deeply inspired by Hannah Arendt in developing his ideas about nuclear weapons, but also about the kind of extinction they either affect or can affect. And he kept returning to Arendt throughout his career and developing this notion of extinction. And there's a sort of tension arising perhaps out of that. So Arendt did write about human beings as earthbound creatures that were dependent on earthly environments and nevertheless risked their destruction and so on. But I think it's fair to say that a good deal of her thinking is tied to human experience. And in that sense, it's perhaps a little bit out of tune with a lot of contemporary scholarship, which is intent on decentering human beings in these conversations about the Anthropocene and extinction and so on. And some of this we can also see in Schell. So despite the fact that we sort of detect a general direction or move in his thinking from the anthropocentric to a more ecocentric perspective, he upholds sort of a human bias, even as he's discussing non-human extinction, as he increasingly did towards the latter stages of his career. And that tension sort of sits uneasily, you could say, with recent advances in the environmental humanities, which filters into IR in several ways. But it's also a quite productive tension in some ways, because what Schell did when he emphasized the privileged place of humans in the world, he kept referring to this through the practice of valuing. So he kept referring to human beings as being sort of the chief valuer in this discussion. So we argue that he really did this, at least in part, as a strategy for shedding light on the responsibility it involved, but also as a way of installing a kind of humility in human nature interactions. And these are, of course, really difficult questions, but just the level of reflexivity involved in these decisions, we argue, makes it both productive and illustrative. Yeah.
So for people listening to this interview who may be inspired by what you say and want to learn more, what would you say would be the main takeaways of the article? Rens, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to highlight 3 issues. So I think the first takeaway is something that Casper already talked a little bit about, and it's to stress the importance of history for grasping our current Anthropocene condition. So there is sometimes a tendency to stress the novelty of our current condition. And while that is understandable, perhaps we wanted to show that reflections on nuclear weapons during the Cold War foreshadow many of the challenges we have now come to associate with the Anthropocene, including questions of species extinction and climate change. And I think it's our hope that our article perhaps can inspire others in the field to pay more attention to the manifold and often paradoxical links between the nuclear age and that of the Anthropocene. Now, I think a second thing is that our focus on Jonathan Schell shows the need for the IR discipline to kind of widen its purview and to move beyond kind of the usual suspects in how we make sense of the nuclear condition and nuclear weapons. And this has really been a recurring theme in our work. So in our book on nuclear realism, as well as in other publications, we have consistently argued for the inclusion and uptake of intellectuals who offered original insights about nuclear weapons, but have been ignored or overlooked in IR. And Schell really is prominent among them. And while he is increasingly recognized as an important figure elsewhere, in IR, a reappraisal is long overdue. So we hope that our article also creates some interest in Jonathan Schell as a figure, because there's a lot more to say about him than we have done in this article. And my final point kind of follows from these and concerns the need for IR to engage nuclear weapons in ways that move beyond the narrow perspective and concerns of strategic theory, deterrence, and warfare. So while there is a place for such theorizing, too narrow a focus appears increasingly out of touch with recent political developments, not least the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which rightly stresses the racial, humanitarian, and environmental injustices embedded in the nuclear weapons complex. And by revisiting the work of Schell, we wanted to offer some ways of reconnecting the study of nuclear weapons in IR to these broader injustices, especially perhaps that of climate change.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for agreeing to be interviewed and giving us this wonderful insight into your research. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. For those of you who are keen to learn more about this article, you can read the full version on the first view section of the RIS website. If you're a BISA member, you can access this free of charge as part of your membership by logging into your account. And if you're not a BISA member, you may be able to get access via your institution. And while you're here, please do look at the BISA website, which is www.bisa.ac.uk, to learn more about us and see all the benefits that a BISA membership can bring you. I want to finish by thanking Rens and Casper once again. Thank you so much for doing the interview.
Thank you.
And goodbye.